Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. A day of addresses at the United Nations General Assembly by the leaders of the great powers, Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin, notably, because these two leaders of what was once the Cold War of the 20th century are now looking at a changing map, erasing borders, the Ummah in play. Mr. Putin announcing a campaign against the Islamic State. We know that Russia has put major combat units into Syria. We know that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is operating very carefully along the Syrian coastline and into the Aegean. We also know that Mr. Putin said that he welcomes anyone to sign on with the campaign against the Islamic State. Mr. Putin identifies the fighters in the Islamic State as from Iraq, from Libya, from Syria, from other parts of the Ummah as well as Europe. However, we are now going to begin this conversation tonight. We will get to Syria with the most recent breakdown in order across the Ummah. This is Afghanistan. You will recall the Obama administration early on identified Afghanistan as the smart war and Iraq as the dumb war. Well, the smart war has turned dangerous because within these last hours, it is now confirmed by Bill Roggio and Tom Joscelyn, who keep the Long War Journal for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, that Kunduz is now in the hands of the Taliban. Kunduz is in the northeastern part of Afghanistan. You will recall, cast your mind back to early fighting in Afghanistan, right after the U.S. jumped into Afghanistan, led by special forces in northern Afghanistan when the offensive began. Kunduz was one of the cities the Taliban fled to in order to be provided air transport out of the country by said to be Pakistan agents. Well, Kunduz is now in the hands of the Taliban again. Is there a battle plan? Can we see what the Taliban hopes to achieve while American troops are still in country and in the event that American troops leave Afghanistan? Bill, a very good evening to you. Kunduz, and you report that the emir of the Taliban is assuring the citizens of Kunduz. What is the significance of Taliban claiming Kunduz? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Yes, so Kunduz is the first provincial capital, or first major city, for that fact, to fall to the Taliban since the U.S. invaded in late 2001 after the 9/11 attack. So Kunduz, by all accounts, I mean, if you look at this rationally, the Taliban should be having even far more success in the south than they should have in Kunduz. In Kunduz, you have militias, this is where a lot of the base of the Northern Alliance is. This is former Northern Alliance. This is where you get a lot of the recruits for the Afghan military. And yet the Taliban massed their forces, put a lot of pressure on Kunduz for the last year, and really stepped it up this spring, started taking over some districts, and they followed through. The Taliban said they showed that they were committed to taking a provincial capital, and they pressed, and they did this despite the presence of 10,000 or 9,800 U.S. troops in country with accompanying air support and other NATO forces there as well. This is a major, major victory for the Taliban. Note that it's not the Islamic State, which everyone likes to focus. The Taliban just came out of this leadership change with hiding the death of Mullah Omar, and everyone told us the Taliban's fractured and they're irrelevant now, and the Islamic State is ascendant, and yet the Taliban take a provincial capital. Again, a massive victory for the Taliban, and if the Afghan security forces can't quickly retake the city, things are going to start to get really ugly.
Did the Afghan army run away, Bill? Do we know?
It's unclear. There were reports that the bulk of the Afghan forces were on the outside of the capital fight. This is what the official party line is, but given that they've been less than honest, the Afghan military and security forces and police and the government have not been forthcoming on these events. They're always kind of caught two steps behind. It's hard to take them seriously. There have been rumors over the last couple of days of Afghan forces cutting deals with the Taliban and abandoning positions. These are unconfirmed rumors, but when you see what happened, I mean, apparently there was heavy fighting. You've seen reports of possibly hundreds of people killed in the fighting. The Taliban took, possibly 60 to 80 casualties. The Afghan security forces probably the same. But at the end of the day, the Afghan military, which is, equipped with American weaponry and training, it fell to the Taliban, which doesn't have air support and ISR and the logistics and all the fancy things that governments say they need. You need to win in the field. The Taliban are committed, and I think that's the first thing that is going in their favor.
Kunduz is now reported and confirmed in the hands of the Taliban. The Afghan National Forces are either driven out of the city, ran away, or planning a counterattack. We'll watch this. We go now to Syria. We move from Afghanistan, northeastern Afghanistan. It's a vast battlefield. There are theaters, and we're talking about the Afghanistan theater and now the Syrian theater. Tom, a very good evening to you. You're reporting that the new Syrian forces, NSF, have in some fashion cooperated with al-Nusra Front. This cooperation includes handing over equipment and ammunition. Was this witting handing over, and what do we know about what part of the al-Nusra Front? Good evening to you, Tom.
Well, good evening, John. Well, it appears that a commander from these new Syrian forces, this is the U.S.-backed rebels, the guys who are receiving the equipment and training from U.S. taxpayers. One of the commanders in that program, it looks like, actually either defected to al-Qaeda, meaning al-Nusra Front in Syria, or decided to hand over his equipment and ammunition to al-Qaeda in Syria in exchange for safe passage. It's not clear. There are actually conflicting stories out there about exactly how this went down, but the bottom line is this is yet another blow for the train and equip program for the U.S. Now, keep in mind, John, everyone's focused on ISIS. In fact, the train and equip program is focused on ISIS. But now we've had on a couple of occasions where it's not ISIS that's actually interfering with the U.S. program. It's al-Qaeda, the Nusra Front in Syria, which, of course, is a bitter rival of ISIS in Syria. And a couple times now, the U.S. has tried to interject these guys into the battlefield in Syria, and it's been al-Qaeda that's been waiting for them. It has the intelligence to interfere with the plans. Back in July, in fact, about 54 different U.S.-backed rebels went into the Aleppo province, and it was al-Qaeda that met them and either kidnapped them or killed them, basically made quick work of this small cadre in Aleppo province. So what we're seeing right now is that, in fact, it's al-Qaeda in Syria that it's getting in the way of this U.S. train and equip program, not ISIS.
The fact that a commander turned over equipment, does this mean that the whole NSF is now suspect, Tom, that we have no reason to trust any of the training, any of the agents, that we're looking at betrayal?
Well, it's not really clear if he was actually a commander or he was someone who was rejected by the program and just managed to weasel his way back in once these guys came back into Syria. It's really not clear to me. I think the whole program is suspect from the beginning because they obviously don't even know that al-Qaeda is laying in wait for them. And I mean, I just want everybody to think about this for a second. Here we are sitting in 2015, and U.S. policymakers and strategists are trying to build a rebel army to confront the Islamic State, of course, piecemeal and small cadres. The effort's basically a joke. And yet, as these policymakers and strategic thinkers are doing this, they don't even think about al-Qaeda, maybe not want U.S.-backed rebels in their neighborhood, which is really absurd. And we're here in 2015. And it's al-Qaeda that, going back to late last year, cleaned out the guys who were receiving covert U.S. support and assistance in the Idlib province. And this basically was the beginning of the takeover of the Idlib province. And what's happening now, of course, is that the al-Qaeda-led coalition, Jaish al-Fatah, is creating another jihadist state in Syria, in northern Syria, sort of in parallel to the Islamic State's efforts.
Is this al-Nusra Front connected to the Khorasan group that was a target when the U.S. launched strikes against ISIS in 2013?
Yes. There's a lot of confusion about this because the administration used Khorasan group to describe a cadre of veteran al-Qaeda operatives who relocated to Syria and who were planning attacks against the West, among other things. Al-Nusra Front is a regional branch of al-Qaeda, so they have responsibility on behalf of al-Qaeda for the jihad in the Levant. The Khorasan group is an elite cadre that came from a number of different areas around the world where al-Qaeda operates. They came together under orders of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, to relocate to Syria to basically try and start laying the groundwork for using it as a launching pad for attacks against the West. And they were embedded within al-Nusra Front, this regional branch of al-Qaeda, as part of that effort. But there's overlap in terms of some of the leaders. Some of the guys are leaders in Khorasan group and also leaders in al-Nusra Front. The bottom line is they're all part of al-Qaeda. It's just different parts of al-Qaeda, and they have different functions.
Significant, and Tom reports this, that Jaish al-Fatah, the alliance we're talking about that's linked to al-Nusra, has captured more territory from the Assad regime this year than the Islamic State. It is not clear if the Russians have plans to move against al-Nusra, but al-Nusra is now occupying Idlib province and Aleppo province just north of Latakia. Makes sense for security that the Russian campaign just getting underway will have to deal with both aspects of the jihadists. Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio. When we come back, the Uyghurs in Syria. Why does that matter? Uyghurs. They're from Tajikistan. They're from Xinjiang, the westernmost province of China, once called once identified with an independent state, and now identified with rebellion, with terrorism, with resistance to the overwhelming Chinese state. Why are Uyghurs in Syria? And what does it mean? What's the advantage for example, Vladimir Putin? Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor, Tom Joscelyn, and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's Long War Journal. It is said in journalism, when a story's right, it gets bigger and bigger until it takes in the whole world. Well, the story of the war fighting that we know in America as the War on Terror beginning 2001 now crashes into Syria, and Vladimir Putin's speech today to the United Nations, to the General Assembly, to the world, looking for allies. Join us in the fight against ISIS. Well, who is showing up? This is a surprise if you haven't seen the news. China's showing up. The Chinese fleet at Tartus. Why? The Chinese are getting involved in fighting ISIS because ISIS is part of a chain of jihadist, Islamist groups that are a threat to world order, threat to states. One of those states is China, it believes, and there's reason to go along with the Chinese reasoning here because the Uyghurs are in Syria, according to a report from Bill Roggio. Bill, the Uyghurs, who are they working with? How long have they been there? What do we know about their fighting against the Assad regime?
Yes, John, the Uyghurs are fighting as part of the Turkistan Islamic Party. It's an al-Qaeda-linked affiliate group that operates in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They've been operating in Syria as well for several years. It's a very effective jihadist group. It's one of several allies like the Islamic Jihad Union and others. All these groups, they have a stake in not waging jihad just in their own areas, but to do it in other areas. For instance, the Islamic Caucasus Emirate, the previous emir of the Islamic Caucasus Emirate, Abu Muhammad, he had said, look, we are sending our fighters to the Caucasus or to Syria from the Caucasus because we have a debt to pay. Because they came to help us, the Arabs came to help us when we were in need, and now we're giving back. And it's the same thing with the Turkistan Islamic Party. Turkistan Islamic Party is one of these groups that really loves to put out videos of training camps of its children. In Afghanistan, it's also women. It's released tapes that we've tracked of these of training camps for women and children several times over the last couple of years. These are in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they're starting to do the same thing inside Syria as well. I think they're firm believers in get them young, train them up, and make them jihadists by the time they're 12.
What kind of numbers, Bill, do we know for the TIP?
TIP numbers we don't know. I would guess based on what I've seen from their operations and the little we've seen from the camps and pictures that they've released, probably several hundred fighters in Syria at the least.
Tom, the Uyghurs, you can take us all the way back to Tora Bora on the Uyghurs working with al-Qaeda. Please do, quickly.
Quickly, the Uyghurs, what is that al-Qaeda has several different ethnic groups from Central Asia and, of course, this part of China, Xinjiang province in China, where they groom these groups to basically adopt al-Qaeda's doctrine. And they did this with the Uyghurs in China, and they brought them into training camps in Afghanistan prior to 9/11, including camps at Tora Bora, where the Uyghurs were trained. They were trained at a camp in Tora Bora by a guy who was turned out to be a fully made al-Qaeda man. And essentially during the Battle of Tora Bora in late 2001, U.S. intelligence officials concluded that, in fact, the Uyghurs acted as a blocking force at the Battle of Tora Bora, where the initial sort of forces that were being sent in to try and hunt down al-Qaeda and its allies were basically blocked by Uyghurs and others from these different groups who were sitting sort of at the front part of the road there. And in fact, what ended up happening is that 22 different Uyghurs ended up being captured and shipped off to Guantanamo, where they were held for years.
And the Uyghurs fighting in Syria, Tom, this isn't a sizable group. This isn't tactically or strategically significant. You believe this is a show of collegiality, of brotherhood, of common purpose? That's why they're there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of the global jihad. Global jihad is often misdefined, but what it really means is that basically once you adopt the al-Qaeda-style jihadist ideology, you'll go wage jihad anywhere because it's all part of the same conflict. And so that's what the Uyghurs are doing. That's what the Chechens are doing. That's what you got Tajiks and Uzbeks and all sorts of different nationalities and ethnicities have come together because once they've adopted that global jihadist ideology, once the fight is laid down, the line is drawn in the sand, they show up to fight the common enemy.
Bill, both you and Tom have a piece from last week, and I want to make the link here because I recall the video early on. The Army of the Emigrants and Helpers, Jaish al-Mujahideen, Awal Ansar, JMWA. Is that the group that has the Chechens in it, or did once upon a time, Bill?
Yeah, that's correct. This group previously was led by successive Chechens. Now I believe it's led by a Tajik, but it still has Chechens in the leadership and rank and file as well. Probably one of the more effective jihadist groups that are fighting inside Syria. They consider themselves part of the Islamic Caucasus Emirates, but they are obviously have become part of Al-Qaeda's, officially part of Al-Qaeda's sphere, since it has joined the Al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda's official branch in Syria. Again, just further evidence that the Al-Nusra Front is expanding its ranks, it's melding in these groups that it has previously operated alongside it in the battlefield. I mean, look, they share the same goals, have the same strategy to overthrow the Assad regime and then contribute to the greater cause of establishing a caliphate and imposing Islamic law or Sharia law. So it's a natural fit for the Mujahideen army to join the Al-Nusra Front.
Tom, you're testifying in the House Foreign Affairs Committee tomorrow about the Syrian war, and questions are going to come up about Russia. Is Russia fighting ISIS? Is proposing to fight ISIS, or is Russia fighting where the Chechens are, Tom? That would be al-Nusra. Do we know?
Well, so far we don't know what they're going to do. This gets very complicated, but I think...
We have about 20 seconds, Tom.
Okay, well, the big thing to keep in mind is that it's al-Qaeda and its allies, including a Chechen contingent, that pose the most immediate threat to the Latakia coastal province, which is where the Russians are basing themselves. So I expect they'll go after them because that's basically the most immediate threat to them and the Assad regime.
Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. It's an overwhelming battlefield. It stretches from the Atlantic to the Hindu Kush. I'm John Batchelor.